that there's anybody that's recorded in the Bible that hasn't, at one point, been in a hopeless situation. So it was very, very hard to pick some of the people that I wanted to share with you today. Obviously, we only have a limited amount of time. So that's whether they were in those hopeless situations from their own doing or they were made an example of by following God's plan. He always has pulled them through. And also, while we're talking about it, it might bring to mind some of the situations that we've been in during our lives that we thought there was no way out of. I know that was definitely how I felt when I was reading through some of the details of the stories. I was like, yeah, I feel I can really sympathise with this person and about situations that I've been in before. So I've always enjoyed reading stories from the Bible and remembering how the faith of God's people was recorded for us and showing how he leads them through. I think it helps us have a better perspective when it seems like those waves of hopelessness wash over our lives and our faith is put to the test. We won't be going too in-depth, like I said before, though all of the stories have so many miraculous moments in them. We just don't have the time to delve really deep into them today. But the first person I want to look at is Jonah. So if you have your Bibles, feel free, open them up. We're going to be doing a little bit of reading. So if you'd like to just sit back, I do have them all on slides. If you've got your Bibles, open them up. We're going to be reading from Jonah chapter 1, and we're reading verses 1 down to 17. So a little bit of reading. I'm happy to read that for you, and you can just relax and watch the slides if you like. So Jonah chapter 1, starting at verse 1. The Lord gave this message to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up and go to the great city of Nineveh. Announce my judgment against it, because I have seen how wicked its people are. But Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction, to get away from the Lord. He went down to the port of Joppa, where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and went on board, hoping to escape from the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. So the captain went down. I missed verse 5 on the bottom of that one. Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time, Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. So the captain went down after him. How could you sleep at a time like this? He shouted. Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives. Then the crew cast lots to see which of them had offended the gods and caused the terrible storm. When they did this, the lots identified Jonah as the culprit. Why has this awful storm come down on us? They demanded. Who are you and what is your line of work? What country are you from? What is your nationality? Jonah answered, I am a Hebrew and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. The sailors were terrified when they heard this, for he had already told them he was running away from the Lord. Oh, why did you do it? They groaned. And since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, what should we do to you to stop this storm? Throw me into the sea, Jonah said, and it will become calm again. I know that this terrible storm is all my fault. Instead, the sailors rowed even harder to get the ship to land, but the stormy sea was too violent for them, and they couldn't make it. Then they cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. Oh God, they pleaded, don't make us die for this man's sin, and don't hold us responsible for his death. O Lord, you have sent this storm upon him for your own good reasons. Then the sailors picked Jonah up and threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. Now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and nights. Now the fear of knowing that he'd caused the storm through his disobedience, the guilt of everyone being in danger because of him, the size of the storm, and then being swallowed by a whale. I can only imagine how much time he spent thinking, if only I'd done what I was asked. And as he sat in the belly of the whale, in the blackness, that situation must have felt overwhelmingly hopeless. I'm not sure that that's a situation that he probably had ever heard that anyone had been in before either. Let's read on in Jonah chapter 2, and we're going to read 1 to 10. So down to the next chapter. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. He said, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I called to you from the land of the dead, and Lord, you heard me. You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, O Lord, you have driven me from your presence, yet I will look once again towards your holy temple. I sank beneath the waves, and the water closed over me. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates locked shut forever. But you, O Lord my God, snatched me from the jaws of death. As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. Those who worship false gods turn their backs on all God's mercies. But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord alone. Then the Lord ordered the fish to spit Jonah up onto the beach. In his hopeless situation, Jonah cried out to the Lord, and the Lord answered him. He didn't say, well, you didn't listen to me before, so that's what you get, or it serves you right. But it wasn't until the whale got its order from God and it spewed Jonah up on the beach so he could return to the instructions that God had given him. The next person that I'd like to look at this morning is Moses. From being set afloat on the Nile River to save his life as a baby boy born during a dark time in Egypt, to being a prince of Egypt, to a fugitive on the run, then years later back to Egypt to carry out God's master plan of delivering his people to freedom, given to him through a burning bush, and to lead God's people to freedom. After the people of Israel had been in slavery for years, the Pharaoh is in such a state of anguish after his son dies in the last plague that he tells Moses to take all of the people and leave. Now they're on their way to the land that God promised them. We come into the story at the point where Pharaoh realises that all of his slaves are gone, and now he's angry and he wants them back. Let's look at it in Exodus chapter 14, and we're going to start at verse 5. So it's Exodus 14, verse 5. When word reached the king of Egypt that the Israelites had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds. What have we done letting all those Israelite slaves get away? They asked. So Pharaoh harnessed his chariot and called up his troops. He took with him 600 of Egypt's best chariots, along with the rest of the chariots of Egypt, each with a commander. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh and the king of Egypt, so he chased after the people of Israel who had left with fists raised in defiance. the Egyptians chased after them with all the forces in Pharaoh's army, all his horses and chariots, his charioteers, his troops. The Egyptians caught up with the people of Israel as they were camped beside the shore near Pi-hahiroth. This is a tricky word. Across from Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up and panicked when they saw the Egyptians overtaking them. They cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, "Why did you bring us here to die in the wilderness? Weren't there enough graves for us in Egypt? What have you done to us? Why did you make us leave Egypt?" So they're just at the start of their journey, and already they have the Egyptian army bearing down on them. Their position camped next to the Red Sea, with the army coming up behind them, meant no escape. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. A hopeless situation. But then this happens. I'm going to read verse 19. Then the angel of the Lord, who had been leading the people of Israel, moved to the rear of the camp. The pillar of cloud also moved from the front and stood behind them. The cloud settled between the Egyptian and Israelite camps, and as darkness fell, the cloud turned to fire, lighting up the night. But the Egyptians and Israelites did not approach each other at night. Then Moses raised his hands over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all night, turning the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground with walls of water on each side. And again, God shows up in the middle of a hopeless situation with a seemingly crazy plan. I can only imagine the looks on the people of Israel's face as they are seeing this happen in front of them, watching the Red Sea part to leave a path of escape from the army coming up behind them. I don't think that it would be anything that I would forget, that's for sure. The next person that needs to be read about, we don't really hear too much about him in the Bible, really, and that's Lazarus. But it's actually someone that's called Jesus' dear friend. And he's in a situation that's definitely an impossible one. His story's in John chapter 11, and we're starting at verse 1. So John 11 and verse 1. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother, Lazarus, was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this." So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." But his disciples objected. "Rabbi," they said, "only a few days ago, the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again?" Jesus replied, "There are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light." Then he said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he's sleeping, he will soon get better." They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him." This situation seems a little strange, that Jesus didn't rush to the side of someone that he classes as a dear friend, like we would if one of our friends was sick. But all along, he knew what he was doing. As we know, when Jesus shows up in any situation, it's a game changer. Jesus arrives to find that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days and is in a tomb. He's also met by Martha, Lazarus' sister, who you can tell is wondering why Jesus didn't show up sooner. And she said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." But then she says, "But I know, even now, God will ask you whatever you want." Showing her faith in him, even through her grief. Here's how the story ends. If you jump down to verse 39. "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believed?" So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of these people standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me." Then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave cloths, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen. This story quickly goes from the most impossible, final, devastating scenario to the most amazing demonstration of God's power imaginable, being raised from the dead. Because when Jesus shows up, in his perfect timing, impossible things happen. Next is definitely one of my favourite stories. And my husband says that a lot of the Bible stories are my favourite stories. It's one of my favourite stories. And it's Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, the boys that exercised their faith and faced being burnt alive to be made an example from in front of everybody by King Nebuchadnezzar. These 3 young men had been taken prisoner during a raid on Jerusalem along with Daniel. Over their time in captivity, the king was made aware and was impressed by how wise they were. And he even made them advisors under Daniel, so they were very highly regarded. They were also looked up to by others, but the king also knew that they served the one true God. So when he built the statue of gold, I wonder if he had them in mind and wanted to test just them. Let's read the story. It's in Daniel chapter 3, and it's verses 1 to 23. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messengers to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all of the province's officials to come to the dedication of the statue he'd set up. All of the important people there. So all of these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshipped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king." You issued a decree requiring all people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harps, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue that I've set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship your golden statues. The golden statue you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. Reading about the intensity of the flames reminds me of the recent bushfires and the reports of how hot the flames were and the intensity. That fire is one of the scariest natural elements because of its unpredictable nature and the devastation that's left in its wake. In this instance, there was no doubt to everyone around that what the outcome would be. They all knew that the only outcome would be a pile of ash. But let's read on in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 24. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothes were not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. I pity the men that died throwing them in. They seem to have paid the price there. But these men did not waver in their faith. They knew that no matter how impossible, that they would stand even if it meant death. Last but definitely not least, we're going to jump to Joshua, and we're going to read about Jericho, the city that felt so safe in its own walls, where the Lord told the tribe of Israel that they would take the legendary city without using any weapons, an impossible situation. So we're going to read it in Joshua 6, verses 1 to 5. Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go in or out. But the Lord said to Joshua, I have given you Jericho, its king and all its strong warriors. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day, you were to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. When you hear the priests give one long blast on the ram's horns, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse and the people will charge straight into the town. God knew the problems Joshua and the Israelites would face even before they did, and he already had a solution. But it hinged on Joshua and his trust in God to carry it out and stick to the plan. It must have sounded crazy hearing, I want you to march around this city, and when you blow your horns after a week of marching, the walls are going to fall down. Now, we won't read all the story, but we'll pick up the finale, and that's down in verse 20. Just a short one, this one. When the people heard the sound of the ram's horns, they shouted as loud as they could. Suddenly, the walls of Jericho collapsed, and the Israelites charged straight into the town to capture it. Now, I want to talk a bit more about Jericho because it leads me to my final point. And that's a bit of the theme with my slides today, being all bricks. The walls of Jericho were an impenetrable force to any army that was trying to take over the city. Before even dealing with the walls, attacking troops would have to navigate their way across a 27-foot wide, 9-foot deep pit that lined the outside of the city. Then there was the wall itself, 17-foot high, 5-foot thick mass of solid stone. If the attacking army managed to get this far without being shot down by archers, all that was left was to defeat the well-trained Canaanite army that was waiting within. That seems pretty simple. This was the reality for Joshua and his ragtag Israelite army. These Israelites, who had seen an entire generation live and die while wandering through the desert, were tired, hungry, and facing what seemed like an impossible task, a really hopeless situation. Now, I haven't lived very long, but I've lived long enough to know this, that running into walls is a part of life. And the bigger the wall, the more hopeless the situation can seem. The large walls of sickness, loss, divorce, addiction, they pop up all around us and they seem impenetrable. And just like the walls of Jericho, these walls rarely stand alone. Walls in our lives are often accompanied by a pit of pain, suffering, and despair, and all the while, the army of hopelessness attacks us on every side. The question is asked all the time, if God loves us so much and is so powerful, then how could he allow those walls to pop up around me? Now, I don't pretend to have all the answers to any of those questions, nor do I pretend to understand how deep or dark your suffering's been. I simply want to suggest that maybe God does his best work from seemingly hopeless situations. When I read the Bible, I read about characters all who face seemingly hopeless situations. In fact, I can't think of a single person who walked faithfully with God without first facing a hopeless situation. Adam and Eve ruined paradise by inviting sin and death into a perfect world. A seemingly hopeless case. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers for his pride and put in prison. A hopeless case. Moses was cornered on the banks of the Red Sea with the most powerful army in the world breathing down his neck. A hopeless case. Gideon was 300 versus 300,000. David stood across the valley from a bloodthirsty giant. Esther was a woman trying to gain a word with a prideful king. Daniel's roommate was a lion, and his friends were thrown in an oven. Jonah sucked at his job, and he got stuck in a whale. Peter was a coward. Paul was imprisoned. The 5,000 had no food. Lazarus was dead. Timothy was too young. Abraham was too old. The prodigal son was too stupid. The walls of Jericho were too strong. And Jesus was humiliated, hung on a cross, and buried in a tomb, burying all hopes of a revolution that was hoped for for thousands of years. Now everybody was ready to close the book on these stories. The end, game over. But if there's one thing we learn from scriptures, it's that we can never place a period where God has put a comma. Because when all other options have been worn out, when circumstances couldn't get worse, when everything else has failed, get ready. Because that's exactly when God shows up. Because Joseph became second in command, the Red Sea parted, Gideon won without lifting a weapon, Goliath's head was on a plate, Esther spoke and the king listened, Daniel tamed the lion, the oven felt like room temperature, Nineveh repented, Peter became the rock, Paul rejoiced, 12 baskets were left over. Lazarus heard Jesus' command, Timothy built a church, Abraham built a family, the youngest son came home to a party, the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, and Jesus pulled off the resurrection, defeating sin and death, and the creation that had been maxed for so many years was now restored for all time. With God, what seems like a hopeless situation is not only possible, it becomes favourable. Because only God can turn a mess into a message. Only God can turn a trial into a triumph, a test into a testimony, and a victim into a victory. His power is made perfect in weakness, so let's hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, because he who promised is faithful, was faithful, and will always be faithful, no matter how hopeless the situation. Please join with me with singing our last hymn. It is 86, How Great Thou Art.